Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Uh, it's a pleasure for me to be here this morning. I'm seeing old friends, old colleagues to discuss this very important contribution in social and economic studies on the modeling of the small open economy. As you'll see from the presentation by DeLisle Worrell and the discussions later on, the preoccupation of this issue um, are both short-term and long-term problems the region face. And I must say that these articles are relevant beyond the Caribbean. So it's a pleasure for me to be here. I should let you all know I consider DeLisle a mentor, and he's had a big impact on my career trajectory. And so I must thank uh, Mary for inviting me to moderate this session. Uh, so, as I said, Dr. Worrell will present for 20 minutes the four findings from this special issue. And this would be followed by a panel discussion. Um, and each each author or the author presenting the paper, uh, should basically answer a fundamental question, and that is, what is the single most important message of your paper? So I would like to now invite DeLisle to start his presentation.
Well, thanks a lot, Tarron, and thanks for those kind words. I'm going to share my screen with everyone now. Sorry about that. So the Caribbean economies are underperforming by all accounts. The aspirations of Caribbean peoples with respect to the quality of their lives and livelihoods are unfulfilled. And by most economic indices, the Caribbean shows badly in comparison with our neighbors and our peers. By the Human Development Index, the rate of economic growth, employment rates, infrastructure, delivery of public services, and foreign direct investment. So, what we are all concerned about is what is the reason for the underperformance, and how can economic development performance be improved? And that's the thing that motivates all of our research. And for that, we're using models, which are the tools that economists use to analyze performance and to advise policymakers on options for achieving their objectives. It turns out, as the analysis in this issue of social and economic studies shows, that the models currently in use in the Caribbean misrepresent the economic structure of small open economies like those of the region. In addition, analysts and policymakers often do not take care to ground their recommendations and strategies in a careful study of the data. The bottom line is that the tools in use in the Caribbean are not fit for purpose, and they are often not used with care. There are three distinct types of good in the small open economy, which cannot be substituted if their prices change. As Tarron mentioned in his introduction, the circumstances which describe the structures of the Caribbean are applicable to all small open economies. And these three types of goods are first, an export good, such as oil, tourist services, and offshore education. If the international oil price falls, oil exporting countries cannot compensate by consuming more of their own production. And the same is true for all exports and export services of small open economies. The second category of goods are imported goods. And these are the variety of consumption and intermediate goods used in every modern economy. If the international price of the import good rises, it cannot be replaced by locally produced substitutes. The third category of goods are goods and services that by their nature cannot be traded, such as government services and administration, domestic public utilities, domestic transport, etc. Although these are not traded internationally, their prices are affected by international prices because they all use imported inputs, like every other production, a kind of production in the small open economy. The models that we use may produce unrealistic or inappropriate results if they're not structured around these three non-substitutable types of product and services. Models of the small open economy should also take account of the specific data and circumstances, including, for example, the quality of the labor force. It is the case with any economy, large or small, that the levels of skill within the labor force are a factor affecting labor productivity, which in turn affects the country's competitiveness. But crucially for the small economy, is the fact that the mix of skills is also has to be taken into account because there is a bias towards job growth in the export sector, which is the economy's engine of growth. So you're going to see that in the structure of the economy, the foreign exchange earning sector, the export sector, or the tourism sector, or whatever is the sector that the main foreign exchange earning sector is going to have a disproportionate primary and secondary effect on the economy in terms of growth and job creation. But the natural growth of the labor force will not necessarily reflect that bias. And so that sets up dynamics of labor market policy and adjustment, which affect things like the education and training policy, questions of inward and outward migration, depending on the mix of skills available and the mix of skills required, and the way in which new technologies and the changing nature of work, including remote work, are all affecting the dynamics of the way that our economies work in changing ways. And these are all things which we have to bend our attention to in terms of our research to understand the things that drive our economies. So the paper by James, Hazel, and Bissoon, for example, is an example of the kind of labor market analysis that needs to inform policy in the region. Policy and analysis must be informed by a careful use of the data. You know, all too often we hear policymakers speak as though all our economies are alike and all small economies are vulnerable and so on. As the paper by Agbeyegbe demonstrates, it is not the case that all small open economies face severe environmental and economic vulnerabilities that require comprehensive support. Agbeyegbe shows that Haiti is in fact the only country that is in this category. The rest of the Caribbean has only moderate vulnerability, due mainly not to climate but to economic factors. Their main problem is the fact that policy resilience is found to be moderate to low in most countries. And in another paper in this issue, Borda demonstrates the heterogeneity of Caribbean economies with respect to disaster risk and macroeconomic volatility. Strategies to improve the economic development to improve economic development in the Caribbean should therefore address the following. The model should incorporate the dependent macroeconomic realities of the small open economy. It should feature at least three goods with distinct characteristics and with no substitutability in production or consumption. And it should incorporate appropriate assumptions about labor quality, labor productivity, and the factors that affect capital formation. Finally, in using the model for the analysis, growth and sustainability, the several dimensions of vulnerability and resilience should be accounted for, and shocks should be measured and differentiated with care. So, just brief notes on the papers included in the volume. The first paper is entitled Reflections on the Modeling of Caribbean Economies, and it deals with the several approaches that Caribbean economic model builders have taken to the analysis of the countries of the region. Considers separately models for long-term growth and macroeconomic stability in the short run. A general inference which emerges from both the long term and the short term horizons is that the growth of small open economies is supply driven, limited by the development of the economy's capacity to produce internationally competitive goods and services. The second paper is a retrospective on the structural macroeconomic modeling of in the Caribbean. This is a survey of empirical models of Caribbean economies over the years. It makes the case that model building was influenced by domestic challenges as well as global thinking and global perspectives on model development. In more recent times, the IMF has been an overwhelming influence on the features of models that we use in the Caribbean. The strategies supported by the IMS models include exchange rate devaluation, reduction of fiscal deficits, interest liberalization, abolition of subsidies, price controls and wage guidelines, privatization of failing state enterprises, trade liberalization, and debt restructuring. Especially for countries, particularly their influence is particularly strong in countries with balance of payments difficulties. The paper also observes that Caribbean model builders have failed to pool our resources to produce a prototype model with which the countries of the region could counter the IMF's suite of policies. The next paper is entitled Dismal Macroeconomics, the Case of Small Open Dependent Economies. And it captures the observed facts of the structure of Caribbean economies. Long run growth is constrained by the balance of payments, and the growth rate is the average for aggregate demand and supply. Increases in remittance flows and foreign demand raise the growth rate, while money creation reduces it. And paper demonstrates the logical sequence of these consequences. The paper draws inferences about the steady state growth rate, fiscal and balance of payments outcomes of monetary policy, fiscal responses to external shocks, and the rate of growth of per capita income. The next paper is my own on the model for a policy model for stabilization and growth in the small open economy. The key to macroeconomic stability in the small open economy is management of aggregate demand such that foreign currency demand can be accommodated by the available supply at all times and in all circumstances. Growth depends on productivity and competitiveness, the factors which underpin the economy's capacity to produce goods and services that earn foreign exchange. The following paper, Economic Development and the Lewis Best Policy Shocks, the Case of Trinidad and Tobago. This paper presents a model in which the growth of the economy is driven by policies to boost capital per worker, the rate of savings, exports per worker, and output per worker in the residentiary sector, which is described as the sector which comprises activities that can produce knowledge, skills, and self-confidence to innovate and produce and export, problem solving capital. And the data, as the title suggests, from Trinidad and Tobago, detailed data is used to test the model. Then this is followed by the paper by Agbeyegbe on cluster analysis of multidimensional vulnerability, insights from small developing states. And this paper finds considerable heterogeneity among small island developing states with respect to the impact of shocks and their resilience. There is, first of all, a group of countries facing severe environmental and economic vulnerabilities that require comprehensive support. And as I mentioned earlier, the only Caribbean country that is in that category is Haiti. Then there's a second group with balanced vulnerability profiles and strong resilience mechanisms. There's a third group comprising countries that are vulnerable to economic and financial shocks that need to improve stabilization strategies and diversify their economies. A fourth group of countries with strong infrastructure but weak governance. And there's a miscellaneous group of countries that need tailored policies. The next paper deals with an assessment of disaster risk and macroeconomic volatility in Caribbean countries using DSG-based assessment. In this paper, Caribbean countries are compared based on the frequency of incidents of natural disasters. There are long-lasting effects of natural disasters in countries that are prone to frequent impact of such disasters, with lower growth, higher debt, and worsening trade deficits. Feature impacts which are not prominent in countries where the occurrence of natural disasters are infrequent. That's followed by the paper on Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe in the face of climate change, the stylized facts and macroeconomic consequences. This paper, very informative, it documents climate change in Guadeloupe since 1951 using monthly temperature and rainfall data. It then uses stylized facts, examples, and data analysis to illustrate the macroeconomic consequences of hurricanes, sargassum strandings, coastal erosion, sea surface salinity, and other climate phenomena which the country has witnessed over that period. And the final paper, Greening a Model of the Small Open Economy. This conceptual paper demonstrates the potential of the green economy to increase productivity and reduce environmental and economic vulnerability in the small open economy. The green economy being described as a set of an interrelated suite of activities within the economy, comprising production, distribution, consumption, and waste assimilation that together marry economic development potential and environmental sustainability. So that's a brief run through of the paper and the main themes that, the papers and the main themes that the issue covers. Thank you.
Thank you, DeLisle. We will now move on to a panel discussion from the authors, and that will be followed by discussions from beyond the authors. So I would open the discussion to anyone who would like to say something about their papers, comments about research agenda. So please feel free to go ahead.
Okay, could I go ahead, Tarron?
Sure, go on, yes.
All right, thanks, Chair. Our paper is a retrospective on a class of models referred to as structural macroeconometric models, which are built in a number of Caribbean countries over time, some in the universities, others in the central banks, CSOs, and in the case of Jamaica, the behest of the PIOJ. The majority of these models fell conceptually within the early Keynesian tradition, or modified over time to address emerging criticisms such as those related to the Phillips curve, the role of expectations, and advances in time series analysis, to name a few. Quite a number purported to generate focus for policy discussion, and others to determine the structure of the individual Caribbean economies. What is remarkable is that despite this considerable effort beginning in the late 1960s, much of this work ignored earlier efforts of Caribbean economic analysis in the sub-region, and most importantly, did not filter into policy discussion or guide policy, either in the public or private sector. The exception was a brief interlude in Barbados with the establishment in 1994 of Forecasting Unit at the Central Bank of Barbados, and the actual publication of forecasts, and the generation of forecasts in Trinidad and Tobago involving colleagues from the Department of Economics at St. Augustine and the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. We end our presentation by identifying two models by authors in this volume, Professor Vanus James and his collaborators, and Dr. Worrell, whose work, we argue, can breathe new life into a Caribbean modeling strategy, both of whom draw inspiration from the earlier traditions. The question is, however, how to advance these perspectives from mere intellectual curiosity to a more central place in policy discussion, which we argue was a spectacular failure of the earlier efforts. Our answer lies in drawing lessons from the way in which the IMF and the World Bank and the IDB have for some time and more aggressively in recent years, have made their models and frameworks more accessible and usable. To illustrate, as complex as their DIGNAD, that is debt, investment, growth, and natural disasters, and DIGNAR, debt, sustainability, public investment, and natural resource in developing countries, or the IDB, FISLAC, fiscal sustainability for Latin America and the Caribbean. Models are, they have developed IT platforms that can allow mid-level public officials without strong modeling skills to be able to do scenario analysis and simulations and generate ostensibly useful results. In the work of the UWI-FRC, which I now lead, our objective is not only to develop modeling frameworks, but to support their residents in platforms that allow for such elaboration. These alternative approaches can provide a richer source of analysis and bring more policy relevance, especially given the continuing low growth Guyana accepted and the fiscal challenges posed by climate change and natural disasters. So thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. I know we have several questions from the audience, and we will get to those in a moment. Some very interesting questions. For example, one pertaining to artificial intelligence and modeling, and I certainly would take a stab at that later on. But if any one of the others want to step out a little from your immediate paper and say something about that, feel free to do so. So who is going to go next? Anyone wants to go from the authors? Thank you.
Tarron, since our paper is not very dissimilar to what Dillon did, let me just summarize what we tried to do, myself and DeLisle, reflecting on the two core elements of the modeling tradition. We did a review of the demand-led models that are famous in the region, starting from the work of Harrod in 1938, Prebish in 1950, SES in 1962, and importantly, Alleyne and Francis in 2008. And we evaluate them against what DeLisle was describing earlier as pertinent facts of the case. That is, we assess the extent to which these models on the demand side represent capture the essential facts, like DeLisle was mentioning. There are some other facts. The signal thing about the models, of course, is they were very abstract. They didn't begin with data telling what the issues are they were going to actually pick up in the countries. The undercapitalization highlighted by Lewis, for example, the weight suppression mechanisms and spillover mechanisms. The data they employed they didn't even bother to employ much data, but the data didn't point to the facts of the case on the ground. Under exploitation of dynamic comparative advantage, emphasized in Lewis's 54 work, potential to learn fast, emphasized in the Lewis 50 work, and nascent intra-industry exports brought to our attention for a long time now in the iconic practices of our musicians, for example. The import dependence that best highlighted with evidence, the volatility of traditional export prices and export prices generally, partly because of the phenomenon DeLisle likes to talk about, which is the small size price taking effects. Authoritarian institutional arrangements pointed to by Lewis back in 1955. Small size, Dimas, Bustan, Thomas, DeLisle with his mantra on the need to deal with size. These kinds of facts were not reflected in the modeling strategies of these demand-led models. And so our general evaluation pointed to the consequences of those omissions and to the fact that at best all they could do is represent growth without restructuring and development on the supply side, capturing the essential point DeLisle is making, that there is a certain sense in which, if you want to talk seriously about development in Caribbean economies, you've got to deal properly with the supply side and the supply restructuring and the build-up of capacity to raise productivity, compete in the export markets and stuff like that. Those are the demand-led models. We took a look at the models that rely on state space methods, DSG type models, FINEX. These are models that rely heavily on stationary processes. They too ignore all the reference conditions I just described and that DeLisle mentioned earlier in the morning. The thing is that they also are using some amazing claims about real people. All of the fundamental challenges of information mastery, fast learning to adjust habits, and present, even in the presence of policy shifts, like what Lucas critique was talking about. You have prices that are certain and individuals that are perfectly rational, forecasting accurately on average. There are no size effects, so you have no price volatility. And there are no issues of certainty equivalence confronting policymakers and decision makers, micro or macro. Individuals, of course, in these state space models notoriously understand fully the underlying consequences of coping with risk, innovation, and competition to exploit opportunities in actual markets. And the economies they are describing, essentially, if you look at the way they build the models, are essentially well capitalized in all sectors. So the central issue is capacity utilization, captured by focus on the dynamics of the output gap. Capacity utilization, capacity accumulation occurs on an inherently stable path without reference to economic restructuring of the kind that the foundation facts would suggest you're going to have to address. And of course, there is no influential wage suppression and spillover mechanism in these kinds of models. You have dynamic cycles around some reference equilibrium output, and you have cycles defined without feedback into the underlying reference output, what we call the natural rate of output and stuff like that. And then you have investment and production functions in all the cases that I have seen, both internationally and in the region. They feature no learning by doing at all, which Lewis pointed out back in 1950 is important. And they don't adjust to policy shifts, the investment and production functions of these models. So you get to represent that kind of abstract behavior with state variables that evolve on a stable autoregressive path, unaffected by the cycles being studied in terms of the output gap. So you kind of have a set of models here that are suggesting that clever management of the money supply and of interest rates or of interest rates is sufficient to generate full employment of capacity. We've had 60 plus years of very active central banks in the Caribbean and enormous trouble with achieving full employment of capacity, which therefore gives the lie to the idea that clever management of the money supply is a prescription for solving unemployment problems in the region. It goes back to the validity of the observation by DeLisle that you've got to deal with the supply side properly and not put too much faith in the manipulation of the money supply, as important as that would be. Issues of import dependence and foreign exchange sufficiency don't arise in these kinds of models. And they're not in any event linked to the rational structure of production and trade and the drivers of productivity growth. They're not there, and they're not there in that particular sense. So on top of that, you have these policymaking institutions that are assumed to be well developed and pose no challenges to the system. That belies the evidence we have in the region that policy is perhaps the most important single barrier to the development of our exporting capabilities, because the governments dominate and control the the latent exporting capabilities in education and healthcare and all the capital services and so on, and use political policy, the focus on supplying domestic demand effectively to block the development of the export capabilities in these sectors. So when we look at these two classes of models, we tend to find that they pose a serious risk of misleading policymakers. And our observation in the paper is that the trouble is not in the mathematics and the statistics and so on, but in the failure to represent the influence of critical facts on the ground. And all such models need drastic revisions to be relevant to the development challenges of the region. So those are the critical points we thought should be made in the paper. And we invite everybody to take a look at them.
Those are valuable comments. I would like to emphasize your last comment in particular. You know, it's not the mathematics that's the problem. It's not the statistics that's the problem. It's the failures of the model to consider the stylized facts of the small open economy. So I think that's very important. You know, before I get off on what I think some of these models should include, we have 7 minutes more so for this section. So I want to give the authors a chance to say something about their paper. Anyone can step in. Winston, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you very much, Tarron. So my paper uses a somewhat different approach to what is normally utilized. We in my paper, we utilize the approach called system dynamics modeling. And what it attempts to do, it utilizes a mathematical approach to essentially look at what is a very complex interrelated system. When you think about the economy is an interrelated system, and you can look at it that way. So we started off with a model of the small open economy, the characteristics that we know from the previous literature. And then on top of that analysis, we then added the characteristics of the green economy to see how the green economy would impact on what we know about the small open economy. And the results essentially led to what I called a triple dividend. The first return on investment was that we saw the green transition reduces economic volatility in small states. The second benefit is that we found that the green economic activity was also uncorrelated with the business cycle. And that's a real benefit for small open economies, because it means that even if you're heavily concentrated in tourism and agriculture, it can lead to significant benefits in relation to diversification. And that's what we're always talking about in the region, diversification. And then the third benefit is in relation to vulnerability itself. We found that because of that, the fact that the non-traded sector tends to be so volatile, the greening your economy can actually help and reduce the overall volatility of the economy by offsetting that volatility of the non-traded sector. And so I want to also come back to answer the question that is in the chat, but I'll let others come in a bit later as well.
Yes, Winston, I mean, your comment raised a very interesting point about the productivity of the service sector, the non-tradable sector, which is really a fruitful area for future research. I saw this issue of The Economist magazine really talking about the US is undergoing a productivity boom, and it did not start with artificial intelligence. It has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. This productivity boom, the conditions were set 8 to 10 years ago. And it's really occurring in what we would call the non-tradable sectors, right? So it's quite interesting. And this has always been a hunch of mine and an intuition, but I've never really been able to model it. How do we model productivity in this non-tradable sector? I think it's extremely important. So your paper is important. It's very important in this regard. So we have a few more minutes. Who is going to go next?
If I may, Tarron, just a minute or two. So I just wanted to piggyback on what DeLisle and Vanus raised and Dillon raised earlier. So look, the textbooks, the standard canonical models are not designed or constructed with our economies in mind. And I think we should start with that basic premise, right? So we should be very, very careful with what we introduce in the classrooms or how we introduce it, certainly what we import at the level of the central bank. I really like the point Vanus made earlier about the early traditions weren't really keen, not that weren't keen on facts, right? Data was very limited. So I just wanted to highlight 8 points, 8 facts that I was really trying to think about in poetry and real sector. Sorry, I'm just being interrupted. It's like, yeah. I focus on these facts because I wanted to make the point that it's the same data generating process that generate these facts, and we need a coherent model, one model, right? Not a basket of models to explain these things coherently. If we don't have a coherent model that is homegrown, Caribbean grown, of course, our policy response will not be coherent. All right, that's the key point. So I just want to end it there because I know there are other co-authors here that should jump in. I'll end it there, Tarron. Thanks.
No, thank you. Kenneth, so over to you.
Yeah. So our paper is Economic Development and the Lowest Best Policy Shocks, the case of Trinidad and Tobago. The paper models 8 interdependent variables, right? 4 which we consider core and 4 non-core. The non-core are GDP per capita, labor productivity, the rate of profit, the domestic price level, and the core are capital per worker, the rate of savings out of income, output per worker, and export per worker, right? The paper took data from 1970 to 2022 and run the models. So what in essence we did is like look at the core variables and how when a change in the core variables impact the other variables, which would lead to economic development in the country, right? We used a static forecast and a dynamic forecast to sort of check the fit of the data, and both static and dynamic forecasts fit the model extremely well, right? We also use policy shocks to variables, and if we were to change, like make a policy shock to one variable, it would not change the model significantly. But if you use policy shock to the core variables, it will change the model, say by 1% shock, I think led to a 10% increase in GDP per capita. So I'll leave it there for now till the discussion starts.
All right. Thank you, Kenneth. I was told we could go beyond the hour. Is there any other author who would like to say something about their paper before we go to the general audience? All right. So if no one else is going to go, so let me give you. I will use this privilege of sharing this session to give you my experience on Caribbean economics, and I'll start it this way. I've refereed a lot of papers for SES, Caribbean journals, even Caribbean Quarterly. And there's one pattern in these papers is the loss of the history of thought the region, right? And some of this came up. I mean, one of the purposes of this special issue is really to bring younger researchers up to scratch with what were done before, right? And so this is very important. If you're going to build models that consider the facts on the ground, then we need to also go back with in Caribbean history of thought. So that's one way. That's one of the points I'd like to raise from my experience. Some of the facts on the ground were well covered in the presentation, but I'd like to reiterate a few. I do believe that the region faces a heterogeneous geographical constraint. This is Haiti definitely is unfortunately located in that path. And if you look at some of the hurricanes that passed through there over the years, it would miss Dominican Republic and it would hit Haiti. That's because of that wind pattern. And this is documented, and there are researchers in the region who have done this. The small population and the distance amongst the countries, of course, as we know for a long time, present a constraint, a transportation cost constraint, right? So there were talks only recently about having a Southern Caribbean ferry service. I don't know what's the status with that. And of course, it leads to certain separation and institutional and norm formations where a politician might also be interested in what's going on at home alone instead of looking out more outward regionally. And I also I firmly believe this now that places like Guyana and Suriname do face a different type of geographical constraint, right? So I think this is very important when we build our models. So the question is, how do we go about building models? And I mean, the advice I would give to young researchers is to be eclectic, right? Is to learn from various traditions, right? I know not everyone likes eclecticism, but it's very important to do so. You could learn a lot. So if you're talking about the long term, if you want to model Caribbean in the long term, and you're doing so from a mainstream neoclassical tradition, well, then it's always a supply side model, right? And yes, the region faces serious supply side bottlenecks. There's no doubt about this. One came up this morning in the discussion: high equilibrium unemployment. But what I haven't heard from the presentations is this equilibrium unemployment cyclical? Is it a high cyclical? It can't be cyclical. It has to be structural and frictional, right? In nature, right? So so if you model the economy from a neoclassical framework, and I'm talking here long-term problems, we haven't gone to stabilization issues yet. Then we have to think about all these frictions and geographical factors and high frictional unemployment, structural change and high structural unemployment. On the issue of stabilization, well, if you have a Caribbean model and you're dealing with stimulating impulse response functions or anything of that nature from a representative agent model, then it must have a foreign exchange market, right? There has to be some consideration of foreign exchange because it seems as though monetary policy is done not through the money supply, right? It's not through controlling the money supply or the interest rate, but it's largely through the foreign exchange market in the region. So that has to be central to the stabilization analysis. So I have my thoughts. I'm gonna give the floor to everyone, but since we are now opening up, Dr. Gampat, I think, asked a fundamental question: how would artificial intelligence change everything we do, including modeling in the Caribbean and modeling small open economy, given the fact that we agree that the off-the-shelf models from the advanced economies are not the best, right? I must say, though, I omitted one point. If we move on from beyond the mainstream tradition and we're thinking about the long term, Well, then there is a well-established framework on this, right? I mean, Collin wrote his PhD thesis on this and added important contributions to this framework, the master payment constraint growth framework, bringing in the third wall growth model and so on. I think they are very relevant to the region, and there are important tweaks to this model that needs to be done. Well, fundamentally, what that framework is a long-term framework, but it is driven by the demand side. And the demand is not an internal demand, it's an external demand. And this goes back to DeLisle's repeated point. Really, if you get everything right, there's a market out there for your products, right? So you're as constrained. But the fact is there is a demand constraint from a more non-mainstream heterodox tradition. On the AI, I don't want to use the word AI because I am not qualified to talk about AI because I keep telling my students this because artificial intelligence, the mathematics of this really was being studied 50 years ago, right? So what we call AI is very large language models. And so the utilization of large language models, would it change what we do in a fundamental way? I don't, because the models are not trained on our institutions, our history of thought, the fact that economics is not a purely mathematical discipline, although it has a high level of mathematics. I personally believe that large language model can increase our productivity, but cannot replace us or replace our thinking. So,
Tarron,
yes, I'll give you the floor now.
that's me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I have a question, but a couple of comments first. And also to tell you that I put a link to my presentation in the chat for anybody who wants to download it. So Collin keeps talking about the persistence of fiscal dominance. That's not a problem. That's a reality. Uh, you know, and so we have to say what the fiscal tool is really the key tool in the small open economy because for one thing the government is so dominant in the economy and the fiscal is what really puts things out of whack in most cases. So I think the question really is, what is the appropriate fiscal policy? Not so it's not a question of, it's not a problem as such. Uh, uh, um, on the question of vulnerability, you know, I particularly liked Temisan Agbeyegbe's paper because it provides examples of the importance of starting with the facts. The Caribbean, if you look at the results that he's gotten from his cluster analysis, the Caribbean is not especially vulnerable to climate change effects. Those are the facts. Our main vulnerability is to economic policies. And we are not even more vulnerable than any other small economy as far as that is concerned to external issues. Our main vulnerability, the main thing that is wrong with these countries is poor economic policies. We waste the resources that we have. We do not do the things that make us more resilient. There are all kinds of countries that are far less well endowed than the Caribbean, particularly with the things that we are strong in, for example, tourism, who do much better. And the reason they do much better has nothing to do with the vulnerabilities of natural resources or anything. That has to do with the quality of governance and the appropriateness of their policies, and particularly their fiscal policies. The So those were the 2 points that I wanted to make. There was a question. There was a point in the chat about size, and everybody cites Singapore as a small economy. Singapore, if you're talking about the Caribbean, is not a small economy. Singapore is an economy of the same size as Malaysia and Thailand, and probably bigger than Vietnam. So it is a small economy compared to the United States or to China, but it is not a small economy compared to our economies. And my final point is a question really for Dillon. To tell us a little more about the UWI-FRC that he mentioned.
Thanks, DeLisle. Chair, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Right. So the FRC, the Fiscal Research Center, was given an endowment through our former Minister of Finance, Nigel Clark, to set up an independent agency to deal with fiscal matters across the Caribbean. Although the money came from Jamaica, it's really a Caribbean creature. And we have been working on that. We just have a building, recruiting staff, and we are putting ourselves in a position to build the kind of models that will allow us to answer some of these questions. As I say, we are open to a range of ideas, and in my view, what you need is alternative frameworks, and let's see which perform best. I don't want to take priori the position that the World Bank and the IMF has nothing to say. The point is that they're saying a lot. They're here. So we've got to see what they do, understand what they do, and create models that are, in our view, appropriate. The problem is how we get our models into the mainstream. And I think that my mandate to the FRC is to see how we could develop IT platforms that will allow us to have a range of models being utilized. But it's it's 2 years old, and it's going to be self-financed, so we have to raise resources. And I will send to you our recent report, DeLisle, and other colleagues, you get a sense of what we are. But this came out largely of Jamaica's fiscal challenges, which you've spoken of, the poor fiscal performance and the inability to manage our public finances, to keep our debt levels down and so on. So it's part of the institution building that has come out of the Jamaican experience. Of course, you may be aware of the Independent Fiscal Commission as well, which is an agency also with independence. But the FRC is Caribbean-wide in terms of its objective. And this year, we're trying to reach out to other ministries of finance. We've had a successful 2-week program on climate change and fiscal risk in Jamaica. And we had one in Trinidad about a month ago, and we're going to have one in Barbados in June. We're supported, by the way, by the IDB in this effort. We continue to be grateful to them for that, because at the end of the day, you have to have resources to do these things. But we can remain independent and self-reliant in thinking and in our approach. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that information. Now I'll go to the audience. Anyone has a question? I know there are questions about Singapore and the size and all of that.
We wait on the audience. Let me ask a question of both DeLisle and Winston, because I've been following their work on size, not just now, over the years, really, and their approach to it. And in the recent past, I've been looking at the time series on product prices, oil prices, and stuff like that. Just a couple of weeks ago, one of the statistics officers called me for engagement on data as it relates to the costing of Airbnb rooms across the region. So what struck me while looking at the data they asked me to consider is the enormous amount of volatility you see in the data. And I wonder if that is not a consequence of price-taking behavior. And if it is, would that not mean that one of the methods by which we could grapple with the factor size is the construction of what I would like to describe as certainty equivalent prices in order to represent the impact, the significance of small size. So it's not just population size, even GDP per capita and stuff like that, but also just this price vulnerability issue that has been with us for a long, long time and been observed by men like Lloyd Best and others for decades now. So how would you deal with this business of price-taking behavior that is embedded in pretty much all of the things we've been trying to export from eternity to now as an index of size?
Winston?
Yes, please. I missed the question.
Winston, what I was asking is how would you deal with the enormous amount of price volatility we see? Is it not likely to be an indicator of price-taking behavior in the region, concentration of our exports on price-taking exports almost? Oil and gas, for example, is notorious for that. Every Monday morning, it brings down the governments in Trinidad and Tobago. And isn't that one of the effects of small size? In other words, we're not able to make prices on any stable track. We are price takers. Isn't that a consequence of small size? And therefore, shouldn't that be used along with all the other indicators in your work to pick up some of the size effects, certainty equivalent type prices and stuff like that? Would take account of that. I've been reflecting on that, given I've been following what you've been and DeLisle have been doing to attempt to grapple with price indicators in your work.
Yeah, I think you are right. It could be an indication of the size effect where it depends on the industry, where firms are simply setting the price based on what they think is the market price. But each industry is also a little bit different. So, for example, there are some industries within the Caribbean that are highly concentrated. So if you look, for example, at the financial industry is quite concentrated, but you still see pockets of volatility in that segment of the market as well. So you wouldn't see it. So I think it depends on the level of detail at which you go to look at the industry. I try not to make broad-based judgments until you sort of look at the data across different industries. So my simple answer to that is yes, it is an initial first pass, but I think it needs a little bit more research to come to a firm conclusion.
Yeah, thank you. If anyone in the audience has a question, feel free to raise your hands.
Just on that point, Tarron, it's a challenging thing to address. We have a colleague, Quinn Weeks, who some time ago did some micro work trying to do something along the lines that uh, um, Vanus is suggesting. It's not any sort of a risk-free price, but it is a price that or index that incorporated several different attributes of the accommodation along with the price that is being offered to have a kind of a composite kind of index. Um, Also, you can sort of develop some kind of a competitive index rather than price per se, based on a similar sort of logic. And there you can incorporate, for example, the rate of uh, or the market success of the industry in the particular country. So if the country is able to maintain its market share in spite of an increase in its relative price, then that is an indication. So the index would be that would be an improvement really in their competitiveness.
I mean, I
It's a
just say
very
quickly
important
that
point.
I agree with those comments. I agree with what Winston was saying in particular, that you'll have to look at the data and make up your mind about exactly how to represent the influence of size in certainty equivalent price indexing and so on. I think the comment by Winston goes right to the heart of the discussion that we've been having all morning, which is we have to look at the facts and build our models based on evidence.
Yes, thank you all. We do have this. Yeah, I noticed that. Well, DeLisle did mention this response to the Singapore question in the chat. I mean, I would like to add something briefly before we proceed, and that is, if you look at the data from 65, 70, Singapore had a higher per capita income than any Caribbean country. To keep that in mind. So, as a starting point, so I think DeLisle hinted, give some hint as to why that may be so. All right, so I think it seems as though we've come to the end, and this was a fruitful exercise. And in closing, I'd like to say to summarize some key findings, and that is we have to take stock of what exists in the region in terms of knowledge, and a lot of the stock of knowledge, or parts of the stock of knowledge. Not everything was published in the Caribbean. Some of it are published outside of the Caribbean. As we consider new ways of addressing proposals for policy, the whole purpose of this exercise is if we agree, as some of the presenters have argued, that our constraint is a policy constraint, bad policies, then maybe some theoretical innovations could be useful to provide new insights. And to get there, we need to understand what was done before. A lot was done, and I think the distinction, if you look at the collection of articles, and I urge people to get a copy of this issue of social economic studies. It speaks to several issues as it relates to the long-term problems of small economies and the stabilization problem of small economies. And I'd like to thank the presenters and for their presentations. We have to thank them for months of work to write these papers. Of course, I know DeLisle did a lot of work putting this together. And Mary did a fantastic job organizing all of this. She kept us in line. Thank you. So we can bring this seminar to an end. And I hope we will have many more seminars of this nature. Thank you all.